Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial, a museum and research center dedicated to preserving and presenting the history of General Douglas MacArthur, which includes the story of World War I and that of the millions of men and women who served in that war. In October 2016, the World War I Historical Association hosted a World War I Centennial Symposium at the MacArthur Memorial. The symposium focused on the year 1916. The following is a presentation by Dr. Paul Jankowski, the Ray Ginger Professor of History at Brandeis University and the author of Verdun, the Longest Battle of the Great War. Dr. Jankowski gave a lecture on the topic, Verdun After 100 Years, an Iconic or Exceptional Battle.
I chose as a title of Verdun After 100 Years, an iconic or an exceptional battle. And I suppose after 100 years one can indeed ask that question. And I suppose at one level everyone here would answer it the same way. In some ways, Verdun was iconic. It represented more than itself, while in other ways it was unusual. It was its own kind, sui generis, if you will. And others have been trying to establish in what ways it was unique. What did it represent, if anything? In what ways was it larger than itself? If Auschwitz is the symbol, rightly or wrongly, of the Holocaust, and Hiroshima of the nuclear apocalypse, then Verdun often has become the kind of symbol of the futility of industrial war. And that's one way. Others, more precisely, want to make Verdun the symbol of the great attritional battles of the Western Front, without really explaining why Verdun, more than the Somme, for example, should enjoy that dubious honor. And others, on the other hand, want to insist that Verdun was unique. It was not symbolic of anything other than of itself. They would look to its topography, the infernal landscape of Verdun, the ravines, the volcanic suggestion, the hell of Verdun. All of those would be right in some way. Each of those interpretations or renditions are right, and there are others. So that, I think, is what I'd like to talk about today, the various ways in which this battle has been rendered. It's generated a rich crop of myths, more perhaps than any other battle of this war. Most of them began during the battle itself, in newspaper accounts in France and Germany and elsewhere, among the men themselves, in deliberations of the high commands, and they lived on for nearly a century before slowly beginning to die off and to expire in our own time. And these myths, and I'm using this word to explain, by myths I do not mean lies. I do not mean inventions or deception. They represent the ways in which contemporaries and posterity tried to understand this battle. And they may superficially distort the realities. In fact, they nearly always do. But just as surely they reveal truths of a different order, and they call on the historian to give each its due, to restore the facts and to respect the legend. So, battles that gain immortality, it seems to me, usually do so by the way they end. By the sun breaking through the clouds at the Pratzen Heights at Austerlitz, or the Imperial Guard giving way at Waterloo, or its charge falling short at Gettysburg. But at Verdun, it's the beginning of the battle that dominated all the retellings, and that's the unprecedented deluge of artillery shells, concentrated within 8 hours, followed by an odd, rather tentative infantry assault by the German units, and then the kind of French reaction in extremis, saving the situation. Now here's a document, and this is a document from a neutral power, written in May 1916. It's a report by the American military attaché in Switzerland, I believe, actually, telling his government, the U.S. is now neutral, this is 1916, what he thinks is going on at Verdun. So we're several months into the battle, and this is May 1st, so the battle began on the 21st of February. He's having a very difficult time telling his government just what is going on. He gives details, and many of them are surprisingly accurate, but he is not able to say what it's all about. Now, I don't think you can read this, but in the first paragraph, he says the assailants show no signs of letting up and seem as determined as ever to attain the goal they have set themselves. Exactly what this is has been the subject of much discussion. And then on the second page, he refers to, in the second paragraph, he refers to whatever may be the causes urging them on. And that discussion that he refers to about why is this happening has gone on ever since. After the war, the legend of Moloch established itself. Moloch, the god or demon of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, to whom the Canaanites were supposed to have sacrificed their children. And the chief of the German general staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, himself launched this legend after the war in an article which he published in 1919 and then in his memoirs in 1920. There he claimed not to have even wanted to take Verdun. He said he had no intention of ever taking the city. That was irrelevant to him. He intended, he said, to bleed the French army white. This was an army that he believed wrongly, but he believed to be on the verge of exhaustion. Calculated, so he said, that it would rush in to defend the ancient fortress town on the Meuse River in eastern France, only to lose itself in the ravines under the devastating fire of his long-range artillery, in which the Germans had an important superiority. And as evidence of this, he gave the text of a memorandum he was supposed to have written to the Kaiser on Christmas Eve, 1915, so a couple of months earlier, a couple of months before he launched the offensive. In the text that he gave in his memoirs of that memorandum, he said that he purported to have set forth that monstrous attritional thinking, bleeding the French army white. This is after the war. During the war itself, there wasn't much talk of that being the German design, but still you can find some versions of this. Here is something from a German satirical weekly. This is during the battle itself, and it does show, without using the word Moloch, something like a Moloch-like monster, with the French supposedly marching to their doom. And of course, this is about Verdun. That legend, which he himself essentially created after the war, stuck. And by then, right after the war, another legend had grown up, and this one was drawn not from scripture, but from classical antiquity. It's the legend of Thermopylae. And this is the defile, the plain on, not the defile, it's the plain in ancient Greece, between the mountains on one side and the sea on the other, where the archetypal defensive battle of all times took place in 480 BCE. And this legend of the defensive battle, this is the legend the French seized on their side. And they used it to depict their own battle, with themselves as the Spartans and the Germans as the Persian imperial invaders. It's the legend of the outnumbered French rushing in to defend the access to the heartland of the Republic against the imperial invader, the powerful imperial host. And in fact, this wasn't the first time that this legend of Thermopylae had actually been evoked in this part of France. In 1792, the French revolutionary general Dumouriez, while maneuvering against the then Prussian invaders, used precisely that term. This is the Argonne in 1792, and he wrote in one of his dispatches to Paris that Argonne, this is the Thermopylae of France. And in fact, that was rather popular in revolutionary France at the time. Neighborhoods were named. This is a district in Grenoble, and they renamed it Thermopylae, Thermopylae. Revolutionaries are very fond of these allusions to classical antiquity, but it's the idea of the Republic defending itself against all odds against the tyrannical invaders. This legend, if you like, now returned in February 1916 when a famous French novelist, Maurice Barrès, used it again when writing about the Battle of Verdun in a French newspaper called the Écho de Paris. He said, once again, that this region, this is the Thermopylae of France. General Pétain, who was by then the commander of the French Second Army, which was the army of Verdun, in charge of the defense of the region, took up the image himself a couple of months after that. And that legend stuck. So, when Falkenhayn put out his legend of Moloch, the French happily added it on to their own heroic Thermopylae. That was after the war. During the battle itself, the French thought no such thing. If you read their accounts of this, they believed, or many of them believed, that the Germans were not just staging some type of attritional battle in which Verdun itself didn't matter. They felt the Germans were in deadly earnest about trying to take this site. And in fact, General Delacroix, who had once been a part of the French High Command before the war, and who was the military correspondent of the established French newspaper Le Temps, told an American newsman, Frank Simons, that he felt that the parallels between Verdun and between Gettysburg were inescapable. That he saw in the German attack on Verdun the last bid of the Confederacy at Gettysburg in 1863, the last kind of throw of the dice, the desperate bid. So that was during the battle itself. When Falkenhayn put forth his Moloch version, the French changed. They eagerly picked it up because it was not a very flattering one to the Germans, this demon, this sanguinary ambition. The French immediately picked it up themselves. So Gabriel Hanotaux, a famous French historian, member of the Académie Française, in his Guide to the Battlefields of the First World War, which he published in 1920, immediately republished this as the true version of what Falkenhayn had intended. And history books, novels, school books, movies, popular songs, and so on picked it up as well. They recycled the image of Falkenhayn Moloch as recently as a televised documentary in France a few years ago. Now, when you think of it, these two legends don't fit at all well together. The legend of Moloch and the legend of Thermopylae are in fact incompatible. That of Moloch sees the defenders, the French defenders, decimated as they hurl themselves at the wall of the invaders. And that of Thermopylae, the French legend, sees the invaders decimated as they hurl themselves at the wall of the defenders. The two just don't go together. But that didn't bother anybody for decades. For a long time, no one worried about that. And no one worried either about the authenticity of Falkenhayn's supposed Christmas memorandum, in which he said he had set forth this way of thinking. That memo was never found by the archivists after the war, and nor has it ever been found since, for the very good reason that he never wrote it. And it appears, it's pretty clear to me at any rate, that Falkenhayn did not even start talking about attrition until several weeks into this offensive, when he realized that his initial designs had failed. Now, what were those initial designs? About this, historians still differ, and I don't want to get into that lengthy debate here. In my opinion, he was indeed, as he claimed, trying to provoke a French response. But it wasn't just a response by the French, and it wasn't just at Verdun. He wanted to provoke responses all over the Western Front, up and down the line between the North Sea and the Swiss border. And in the hope, he thought of restoring a war of movement that he felt the British were too inexperienced and the French too exhausted to fight. He was a realistic general. He realized time was against Germany. He wanted to get something going. In any case, nothing allows one to think that as an astute and realistic general, even a skeptical general, could really believe that he could end the war by investing a town with no strategic significance, with really a very modest infantry force. He, on the 21st of February, in the late afternoon, when his heavy guns either lengthened their fire or stopped firing altogether, he committed only 8 divisions to this supposedly war-ending offensive. And even those he committed very unwillingly and parsimoniously. But nothing allows one either to discern in the response of his French counterpart, General Joseph Joffre, the response of Leonidas against the Persian immortals of Xerxes on the shores of ancient Greece. Joffre indeed intended to win, but he didn't intend to win at Verdun. His eyes were fixed elsewhere on the front. They were fixed on the Somme, the coming offensive on the Somme, where he wanted the decision to take place, together with other Allied offensives by the Russians and by the Italians. He only agreed to defend Verdun to weaken the adversary, tie him down, and to avoid the dangers of a national humiliation. So he committed as little as he possibly could to the defense of Verdun, and he did so to hold off an adversary who himself declined to commit the bulk of his divisions there and to risk his all. And with that, the inevitable happened. No one could prevail. And Verdun thus perpetuated itself, becoming the longest battle of the war and one of the bloodiest in all history. But no matter. The central myth of Verdun, to return to myths, is the myth of willpower. Here is a famous poster. This was a bond issue by the French, the appeal to buy government bonds. And it's courage, on les aura. So courage, we'll get them. It's the end, the last lines of a famous communique that General Pétain issued on the 10th of April after repulsing some German assaults on the hills to the north of the of the city. They are actually the words of a famous music hall song of 1915, On les aura, and reproduced here. Now, the historical allusion here could not be clearer. This is to the volunteers of 1792, to the fédérés, to La Patrie en danger, the country in danger. And for decades, the novels and films on both sides of the Rhine stubbornly elevated camaraderie and courage and willpower and resolve above the din of the heavy guns. In his 1931 film, here's an example. This is a film made by Léon Poirier, French filmmaker. He dwells on the first day of the battle. It was a silent movie in 1929, then released in a spoken version in 1931, and this shows how he portrays that first day. Now, if you notice, turned it off here, but he's dwelling on the German technical superiority, the heavy guns, the German technology. On the French side, it's the peasant in his cottage, the shell landing through the roof of the cottage, and the peasant actually looking at his hunting rifle as though someone going to pick up his hunting rifle and respond in that way. It's a definite attempt to oppose the French willpower to the German automaton. And this would be a dominant popular motif of the way the French would write about this in their legends, in their retelling of this battle after the war. French bodies against German shells, sheer willpower. Now, the same year, 1931, the German filmmaker Heinz Paul, in his movie Douaumont, Die Höhle von Verdun, Douaumont, which is the name of a famous fort there, the hell of Verdun, he took the same day. And here you notice that he deals with the massive German artillery preparation in a brief written excerpt of a few seconds. He prefers to dwell on the soldiers themselves, and what would go on here is the soldiers sort of champing at the bit to leave their trenches. It's again the human element. And here he tries not to insist upon the German technical means. He tries not to insist upon the German artillery, but he insists on the human resolve of the soldiers, their aggressive spirit, and the night before, their anxiety. And this theme of ardor, of human ardor, kept coming up in the German retellings of the battle when they began to appear in the 1920s. Now, of course, the Nazis, when they came along, would seize on this to celebrate the Aryan blood coursing through the veins of the ordinary German soldiers. And and they would that way dam, by extension, the corruption of their leaders and of all sorts of people on the home front. In 1930, a German novelist, playwright, Franz Schellwecker, in his novel with the revealing title Awakening of the Nation, he did just that, trying to celebrate the ardor of the ordinary Germans who represent the awakening of Germany. Now, he depicted in this book, Aufbruch der Nation, the awakening of the nation, the horrors of Verdun, but he also depicted another struggle, that between the soldiers at the front and the corruption of their superiors and the corruption of people at the rear. And we all know what that means. It means the left, the communists, the socialists, the trade unions, the Jews, and so on, the pacifists, the Democrats, and so on. And in fact, if you keep in mind the Aufbruch der Nation, the awakening of the nation, here is the medal that was to commemorate Hitler's coming to power in January 1933. And I don't know if you can see the same words, awakening of the nation. That there's a connection here. That same year, so I'll go back to 1930, to not this year, 1933, but 1930 itself. Joseph Magnus Wehner in Sieben vor Verdun, the novel, The Seven Men at Verdun, ein Kriegsroman, a novel of war. He deliberately instructs the reader in the beginning, and what is the moral of the story, this novel about Verdun, the double and thus inexorable struggle against the enemy and against the spirit of the old. That's to say, the spirit of the old and the decadent and the corrupt and the rotten and so forth that has destroyed Germany. It's a good thing he added that he presented this moral of the story, because then he spared the reader the need to get through this interminable novel. It's extremely bad, very boring. He actually intended it, and it was received as a reply to Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, which had been published in about the same time, and which was in many ways a pacifist novel. So whether filled with Nazi delirium or not, such works all deny the reality of industrial war. They want to deny the war of materiel and celebrate some kind of human spirit somehow, because industrial war suppresses the hero. And that hero is the essential figure of Indo-European warrior mythology for millennia. And in this type of war, with its deluge of poison gas and shrapnel and steel, the hero seems not to exist in these different ways they are trying to restore the human hero. But that's where we have a problem. Verdun gave rise to very few heroes. As I just said, neither willpower nor determination could prevail against this daily deluge of steel and shrapnel and poison gas and so on. The French High Command actually acknowledged as much a few weeks before the battle even began in its infantry regulations of January 1916. These, and I quote, these are the words: "One does not fight materiel with men." That's simple. Those words the High Command laid to rest the cult of 1914 and of the infantry offensive à outrance, in which artillery is auxiliary and poison gas did not exist. And Falkenhayn implicitly admitted as much when he chose to rely heavily on his artillery and really to economize on the use of infantry. And he even instructed the infantry not to push on if they encountered resistance. You cannot imagine being given such instructions in the late summer of 1914 on either side. Another novel of 1931 by a German, Hans Söberlein, then this is called Der Glaube an Deutschland, the belief in Germany. And this was part of this is set in Verdun, like all the others, wholly or in part. He sang of the superiority of the German spirit, the Frontgeist, the spirit of the front, and he explicitly said this is superior to the war of materiel, and he called it the unequaled myth of the German soldier. But all that is pointless. The myth of Siegfried, the myth of Napoleonic élan, that's over. It's finished. The few heroes that there were incarnated on either side two different kinds of human willpower. Well, a defensive willpower among the French and offensive among the Germans. It's the myth of Colonel Drian on the French side, who died valiantly in the early days of the battle, slowing down the German advance in the woods north of Verdun, and of the two German lieutenants who seized the mightiest fort in France. The Germans chose to celebrate their offensive ardor, and sometimes they spoke of Prussian élan, which allowed them to take this great fort of Douaumont. The key French words are "they shall not pass." Ils ne passeront pas, on ne passe pas. And those words appear on every retelling of the battle. On the medal struck by the city, you can see the words "on ne passe pas." On the monument at the top of the hills north of the city, to a particular division that held its ground there, "they did not pass." In the collections of books, "they shall not pass," and so on. That's essential to understanding the French way of talking about this battle. It's defensive. It's a defensive battle. And the Germans, it's an act of refusal on the part of the French. That's the fundamental French attitude that turns up in novels and in all kinds of celebrations of this battle. As I said at the beginning, French chests against German arms. The German is more of the offensive élan, the spirit, the will to attack, the spirit of initiative. In fact, both are rather misleading. Time doesn't allow me to go into the main stages of this battle, but it's usually divided into two parts. One in which the Germans seized ground in the beginning. This lasted several months before the French returned from August on, pushing them back and regaining most of the ground. Yes, there was a defensive phase an offensive phase for the Germans and a defensive one for the French. But in fact, the fundamental reality is that both Germans and French fought in just the same way, both defensively and offensively, sometimes changing roles, sometimes fighting both ways at once, in endless little changes and savage combats that went on in the ravines, in front of the forts, on the hillsides. The idea that one side could celebrate offensive battle, the other defensive, is perhaps understandable. It doesn't reflect the realities of this, of what went on there. Great losses. In fact, one way of looking at that, how else can you explain the casualties 2 weeks into the battle? They're almost exactly the same on both sides. 25,000 dead, wounded, or missing among the French, and the same among the Germans. Final myth that I want to go into is the myth of enthusiasm. If both sides sought to celebrate willpower of different sorts, the idea that men somehow enthusiastically went to the battle. This is particularly strong on the French side, that everybody leapt up with one bound to defend the country. Most of this is unreliable. If the evidence shows anything, it's that the men went up to the line the way they went to work, the way they went to fields and factories because they had to. They even said so. I've been through the letters of the French soldiers, what they wrote home. They would say things like, I do this because I have no choice. And if the censors use any word in describing the spirit of the morale among the men that they can discern in going through their letters, it's the word morose. These men are not happy about what they're doing. They're not going up to the line singing. They're doing it because they have to. Now, in fact, and this is where I'll end, the myth of enthusiasm, like that of willpower, rarely comes from the men themselves. They are not the ones who put out these versions of what went on there. Some of them do, but the ones who really do it are the journalists, the historians, the storytellers, the movie makers, the authors of school textbooks, all the vehicles that constitute what we call, rightly or wrongly, a public memory. And that is not something to be condemned, because without this, an event of that magnitude would have been absolutely incomprehensible to people at the time. They needed some way to understand what had happened here. They needed some way to tame the recent past. And that is the best way to understand these various versions. Without those, I think, if we didn't have those versions of understanding what happened, we would probably all go mad. And those are some of the things I wanted to draw your attention to.
Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, suggestions, or comments, please contact Amanda Williams at amanda.williams@norfolk.gov.